It's great to mix your plaster in small quantities, just enough for 1 or 2 students. You'll want to do 2 parts water to 3 parts plaster. So in this case, I have 4 ounces of water and 6 ounces of plaster. Notice how I'm taking small spoonfuls of the plaster powder and sprinkling them onto the water. You want to do this slowly, and as you go, let the water soak into that plaster. Watch as I'm doing this, the water's continuing to soak up into the plaster. Another way to think of it is that the plaster sinks down into the water. But as it gets more full, it gets to a point where it's not quite soaking up as quickly. In fact, in just a minute, you'll see that the water is not showing up anymore. The plaster is not sinking down below the surface of the water. When it gets to that point, I use my spoon to kind of just really gently spread out the plaster powder on top of the water. And then I'll just let it sit here for 2 or 3 minutes so that I can see that that water absorbs or soaks into the plaster powder. This little light gray spot is where the plaster is wet. It's been a few minutes and you can see that most of the surface of the plaster is light gray. That means it's wet. So now I can take my spoon and gently press down the surface of the plaster and start stirring it up. You need to be pretty gentle because you don't want to whip any air bubbles into the plaster. So just stir gently, work on getting all of the lumps smoothed out. You can use the back of the spoon to sort of press the lumps up against the side of the cup. You could even put on plastic gloves and use your fingers to sort of smush out any lumps. But this is a small enough amount that it's easy enough to stir gently, carefully, to get out all the lumps without incorporating any air. Now start tapping on the plaster cup and you'll see that air bubbles will rise to the surface. Do this for 30 seconds, maybe up to a minute, to see how many of those air bubbles you can get to come out of the plaster. Now gently pour the plaster into the form. Just start in one corner and pour steadily to let the plaster ooze out over the entire piece of clay. This is a good way to get fewer air bubbles. You can see I want to make sure I get as much of that plaster as I can. You want it to be 1/2 inch to 1 inch deep. Now, just like before, we want to work on getting rid of air bubbles. So you can tap the side of the plate quite a bit to get them to rise to the surface. You could tap the form, but that could loosen it. So you might want to stick to just tapping the plate for 30 seconds to a minute until you don't see any new ones coming up. Then just set the plaster aside to let it set up and get hard. After about 10 minutes, your plaster will start to set up and it will get a little bit thicker. So if you want to, you can create a loop to hang it on the wall. Just pull a paper clip open and press it down into the plaster a little bit. And then you could also use a plastic knife or a little piece of cardboard to sort of smooth out the plaster that's covering that paper clip. This is about 10 minutes later. Notice how the sheen has changed. The plaster is going through a chemical reaction, which is causing it to set up really quickly. So within an hour, it's completely ready to pull out of the mold. Just lift it off the plate, and then you can wiggle the form a little bit, and then take maybe a paper clip or a pencil and use it to start pulling the clay away from the plaster. Once you get that started, you can just grab it, and it should pull out pretty easily. Now, just gently push with your thumbs and push that plaster tile right out of the form. The plaster is still damp, so you can easily damage it, but it is pretty firm. Another option you have is to use a plastic knife or fork to sort of scrape the edges. Do this while it's still wet, but one good thing is that it will get rid of any loose crumbling bits that are along the edges. And then, of course, when you're all the way finished, tidy it up a little bit, and then you can sign your name by pressing a pencil into that soft plaster on the back.